Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a good day or night. My name is Chenge, and I'm wishing you the warmest welcome to A New Perspective, a podcast that talks about gender based violence. Today, we are going to explore the power of words, how the language we use can actually shape culture, perceptions, and even behaviors. To do that, we have a guest with us, Simona.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Now, what do you think? How important it is to choose the right words, and how does language shape our reality?
Well, words are incredibly powerful. They don't just describe the world, they actually build it. Every word carries a history, perspective, and a set of values. So when we choose a word, we're also choosing the world that comes with it. That's why picking the right words isn't about being politically correct, it's about being aware. For example, when we keep using masculine terms to describe authority, like chairman or fireman, we unconsciously reinforce the idea that power belongs to men. But when we say chairperson or firefighter, we open that space to everyone. From an anthropological point of view, this really shows how deeply gender norms are woven into our everyday communication. Language doesn't just reflect culture, it shapes it. And when we invent new words like gender neutral pronouns or inclusive titles, we're actually watching culture evolve in real time. And here's the thing, it's not only about representation, language also plays a preventive role. The way we talk about relationships, emotions, or gender influences what we see as normal. For instance, jokes about jealousy, control, or dominance can make violent behavior seem acceptable, but when we learn to speak differently, we start to think differently. So, in the end, changing words can really be the first step toward changing mindsets. And that's how we start building a culture that no longer tolerates gender based violence.
Can you give us some examples of how words convey different meanings according to their gender?
Yes, of course. And this is actually one of the most fascinating aspects of language, in my opinion. You see, in many languages like Italian or Spanish, gendered words can completely change meaning. Take Italian, for example. Sometimes the same root word changes its meaning just by switching gender. Il fine, for example, means the goal, while la fine means the end. This is a great example of how gender can shape meaning in unexpected ways. But beyond grammar, gender also affects how we perceive certain words socially. We often use masculine forms for position of power. Il ministro, il presidente, while the feminine forms can still sound unusual or even less authoritative to many ears. And that's not a coincidence. It's the result of centuries of associating masculinity with authority. Now, there's also a cultural layer here. Humor and pop culture often play with this idea. For instance, the Italian comedian Paola Cortellesi points out how absurd it is that simply changing grammatical gender can completely shift the meaning of a phrase. Think about it. Uomo di strada, for example, means a man of the people, while donna di strada has a totally different, much more, I would say, loaded connotation. And in Spanish, it's the same story. El perro just means the dog, but la perra can suddenly take on a negative or sexualized meaning. So these examples really show how language encodes stereotypes in subtle ways. When we become aware of that, we realize that every time we speak, we're not just choosing words, we're choosing the kind of world we describe and the roles we legitimize within it.
Looking back, when did people start realizing that language is not just a tool to communicate, but actually something that shapes how we see the world? And when did they start trying to change it?
Oh, well, this is such a fascinating part. People have actually been thinking about this for thousands of years. Even in ancient Greece, philosophers like Plato or Aristotle were already debating whether words just name things or actually shape reality. Plato's dialogue Cratylus, and I promise this is super interesting, goes into whether words have a natural connection to what they describe or if it's all just agreed upon by society. So, the idea that language carries power isn't new at all. Jump ahead a bit. In Europe around the 17th and the 18th centuries, people really started trying to standardize language. Think of the Académie Française, founded in 1635. They were basically saying, we need to fix French, make it proper, make it reflect the society we want. Grammar books, dictionaries, all that. Language became tied to national identity and social order. But here's the really interesting turn. Changing language to actually change society, especially when it comes to gender, is more modern. Feminist writers like Mary Wollstonecraft in the late 18th century and later Virginia Woolf in the 1920s started pointing out how the way we talk literally shapes what women can imagine for themselves in society. Woolf, in A Room of One's Own, talks about how patriarchal language limits women's role, not just in writing, but in life. Fast forward to the 1970s and the 90s, when social linguists like Robin Lakoff and Deborah Cameron really formalized this idea. They studied how gendered language affects power, perception, and authority, and how subtle things like using chairman instead of chairperson actually reinforce stereotypes. That's when the foundation for today's inclusive language movement really took off. So basically, humans have always known that words matter, but the deliberate efforts to reshape language to reshape society, especially for equality and inclusivity, really picked up in the last 150 years and have accelerated alongside feminist and civil rights movements. Today, when we talk about gender neutral pronouns, inclusive writing, or even the Italian schwa, we're seeing the long historical thread of this idea come to life. It's like we've been slowly bending language toward justice all along.
And what do you think? To what extent does today's language, which is shaped by historical development, represent our current society?
Well, language is always evolving, but society right now is changing faster than ever. Over the past decade, cultural and social shifts around gender, identity, and equality have accelerated so much that language is struggling to keep up. As people began expressing new realities and identities, traditional linguistic categories just weren't enough anymore. That's why we've seen the rise of gender neutral pronouns in English or the use of the schwa in Italian. And the schwa actually is a great example. It's not just a passing trend, it's really a symbol of change. It helps make written language more inclusive, especially in situations where gender simply isn't relevant. And the interesting part is that it's becoming more common even in institutional communication, which is a big shift for a language as conservative as Italian. Now, of course, language alone can't change society, but it can reflect and reinforce the changes that are already happening. When we start to see inclusivity in the way we write and speak, it becomes easier to imagine and accept it in the real world. So, in a way, we can say that today's language is like a mirror, imperfect, sometimes slow, but still reflecting a society that's trying to become more equal and inclusive.
And for our final question today, what are the limits of these new approaches?
Well, that's really a good question because while inclusivity is essential, we also need a bit of a balance. Sometimes, in the effort to make language inclusive, we risk making it a little too complex or even artificial. Take the schwa. It works beautifully in writing, but it's hard to pronounce, so it doesn't really fit spoken communication. And we also have to remember something important. Not all gender inequalities come from language. There are gender neutral languages, for example, like Mandarin, Turkish, or Hungarian, where sexism and gender based violence still exist. So clearly, the real change has to happen in how we imagine and live reality, not just in how we describe it. Language should adapt to social evolution, yes, but if we force linguistic change without cultural understanding, we risk creating confusion or even resistance. And that's why the key, in my opinion, is awareness. People need to understand why inclusive language matters so it becomes natural, not just a rule to follow. In the end, it's not about inventing a perfect grammar. It's about using language to imagine and build a fairer world, one that, in many ways, has already been imagined. And that evolution needs to be both linguistic and cultural, moving forward hand in hand.
Why do the media tend to report cases of violence in a way that blames women, for example, by focusing on how they were dressed or how they acted and etc.?
I think one of the most persistent and honestly most damaging patterns we see whenever there's a media report about violence against women is this built in impulse to ask what the victim did wrong. It's like a script everyone knows by heart. And the thing is, when you look at it closely, that kind of framing quietly shifts attention away from the man who committed the violence and onto the woman who endured it. What's even more troubling is how this style of reporting ends up reinforcing the idea that women are responsible for preventing men's aggression. If a woman is harassed or assaulted, the implication becomes that she must have failed at protecting herself. Maybe she walked alone, or drank too much, or wore something too revealing. These narratives keep old rape myths alive and, in a way, normalize the violence by suggesting that male behavior is inevitable and that women just have to work around it. And because of that, it becomes even harder for survivors to come forward. Speaking up often means inviting scrutiny, judgment, and a kind of public autopsy of their choices. But it's not just about explicit violence. Even beyond that, women are constantly being evaluated, especially in media spaces. They're either too emotional or too cold, too sexual or not sexual enough, too ambitious or too passive. This endless scrutiny reinforces a social order where women's actions are always measured against an impossible standard. It's a subtle form of policing, reminding women that safety and respect depend on staying within certain norms. And if we think about where those norms come from, they're tied to long standing cultural scripts around femininity. In many societies, a good woman is expected to be modest and dutiful, and whenever women deviate from that by drinking, going out, dressing provocatively, or simply asserting their independence, the media often frames them as having invited risk. Now, when you look at all of this through an intersectional lens, the picture becomes even more troubling. Not all women have equal access to public sympathy or legal protection. A Roma woman, a migrant woman, a queer woman, or a trans woman, they don't just face gender discrimination, but overlapping layers of exclusion. And the fact that these experiences rarely show up in mainstream coverage just reinforces a hierarchy of whose suffering is taken seriously and whose can be quietly ignored. And circling back to the media's role, the language itself plays a huge part in maintaining this whole system. Journalistic phrasing often hides the perpetrator's agency. You see headlines like, "A woman was raped," which practically erase the person who committed the act. The violence becomes something that just happens rather than something someone chose to do. This fits into a wider cultural pattern, often described as rape culture, where sexual violence is normalized through sensationalism, euphemistic language, and objectifying narratives. Every story that interrogates a victim's choices or softens the description of a perpetrator reinforces the idea that violence is an unfortunate but inevitable part of the world, and in the end teaches audiences, even unintentionally, that women's safety depends on compliance and that men's violence is somehow beyond prevention.
Thank you so much for listening to the concluding episode of A New Perspective, and thank you, Simona, for being our guest today.
Thanks to you for having me.
To our listeners, we sincerely hope you enjoy learning about gender based violence. Stay tuned for the second season of the podcast, and take care and goodbye.